Hello friends, I am Professor Smita Jha from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I am doing Health and Disability in Humanities. Under this course, today I am going to discuss Crip theory in health humanity, which is indeed a very important aspect in health humanities as well as in medical humanities. So let us know what is Crip theory. Crip theory in the health humanities reclaims the historically derogatory term cripple to critically examine and de-stabilize societal norms surrounding disability, illness, and the body. It challenges traditional biomedical models by centering lived experience, addressing structural ableism, and reimagining how we define health and normalcy. Coming to the core concept of Crip theory, cripping normativity. It refers to the practice of disrupting able bodied and neurotypical assumptions in literature, clinical narratives, and public health policies. Body mind. It refers to a concept emphasizing the inseparability of the physical body and the mind, directly countering historical mind body dualisms in Western medicine. Coming to the access intimacy, it refers to a communal and political joy of building collective care and accessibility, particularly when institutional structures fail disabled population. Now let us know the power of reclaiming the slur cripple. At the heart of the theory is the intentional reclamation of the word cripple. Historically, the word has been used as a violent, derogatory weapon to pathologize, isolate, and mock disabled bodies. The Crip subversion of this term highlights that much like the word queer, which was reclaimed by LGBTQ activists, disability scholars reconceptualized Crip to strip it of its medically associated shame. It transforms a clinical deficit into a site of pride, defiance, and transgressive political community. Another major concept is crib crime, and it refers to a rejection of linear, hyperproductive temporalities. It acknowledges that chronic illness, energy limits, and cognitive differences require alternative, flexible understanding of time. Let us elaborate a little more about this important concept. Abled body worldview generally focus on weaponizing crib time. Under capitalistic thought, time is money. Bodies are expected to move, think, and produce at a highly optimized mechanical speed. The Crip intervention through Crip theory contradicts this able bodied perception of time by insisting that there is a need to slow down, lie in bed, take unpredictable breaks, or process information differently, and that this is an equally legitimate way of moving through the world. It breaks the clock to fit the body rather than breaking the body to fit the clock. Let us know the key thinkers and text of Crip theory. And the first one is Robert McClure in his book titled Crip Theory, Cultural Science of Queerness and Disability, 2006, formulated the ideas of compulsory able-bodiness, proving that society forces everyone to perform an able-bodied identity to be deemed valuable. The second one is Alison Kaffer, and in her book titled Feminist Queer Crip 2013, Kaffer explored the political relational model of disability. She famously challenged the cultural obsession with futuristic cures, arguing that a future without disabled people is a eugenic fantasy that devalues disabled lives in the present. Third one is Ellie Clare, and in his book titled Exile and Pride, Disability, Queerness and Liberation 1999, wrote on the intersections of trans identity, environmental justice, disability, and class, exploring how bodies are colonized by medical and cultural gazes. Now, let us know the key elements of Crip theory in health humanities. So, the first one is Crip time. As discussed earlier, Crip time recognizes that illness, pain, and disability requires a flexible, non-linear schedule. It rejects the fast paced, hyper productive demands of modern life. Body mind, this element rejects the traditional medical split between the physical body and mental health. It views them as entirely interconnected. So, the cure critic questions the medical model's obsession with fixing or eliminating disability. It argues that society should focus on acceptance and structural accessibility instead. We will discuss about this in greater detail later in this lecture. So, before moving ahead in our discussion about the concepts, mechanisms, and ideas of Crip theory, it is important to first distinguish and understand how Crip theory is different from traditional disability studies. So, how Crip theory is different from traditional disability study is uh, a radical political and academic framework shot that subvert the way society defines disability, normalcy, and human worth. While traditional disability studies often focus on gaining civil rights, legal protections, and basic social inclusion within existing systems, Crip theory aims to dismantle those systems entirely. Rooted in queer theory and disability activism, Crip theory is less interested in asking society to accept disabled people and more interested in exposing how the concept of the normal body was artificially constructed to serve capitalist productivity. Crip theory pushes past older ways of thinking about disability, moving from individual fixes to structural revolutions. To better understand their respective orientations and practical implications, the following table presents the principal differences between traditional disability studies and Crip theory. So, see Crip theory in action and the real world shifts. Though the first is traditional disability advocacy, and the other group is the Crip theory approaches. So, in traditional disability advocacy, well, inspirational representation, which is celebrating a disabled person who climbs a mountain or works a 60-hour week despite their disability, while the Crip theory approach celebrating the messy, validating the person who cannot work, refuses to mask their symptoms, and openly thrives in bed. Similarly, again, in traditional disability advocacy, minimum compliance access, that is, adding a hidden awkward wheelchair lift at the back entrance of a theater to legally meet code. While the Crip theory approach is universal design, building spaces where flexible multimodal access is the structural and aesthetic centerpiece from day one. Again, the traditional disability advocacy speaks the bureaucracy of care, requiring disabled individuals to jump through exhausting, degrading medical hoops to prove they deserve assistance, while the Crip theory approach speaks of mutual aid and care collectives, creating community led networks of care based on autonomous trust, bypassing cold state bureaucracies. Building on this comparison, the following section investigates how Crip theory expands understandings of disability beyond the social model, opening new avenues for theorizing embodiment, subjectivity, and normativity. The foundational social model of disability separates a physical impairment, that is, being unable to work, from disability, a building only having stairs. It argues that society disables people by refusing to build ramps. And some of the core ideas include: first, the Crip critique. Crip theory points out that the social model sometimes makes the physical reality of impairment too clean. It can accidentally ignore the very real, messy elements of disability like chronic pain, mental exhaustion, and bodily fluids. So, Crip theory demands a space for the complex realities of the body mind while fighting societal barriers. Second one is intersectionality and interdependence. Crip theory does not view disability in a vacuum. Heavily influenced by the work of Black, Indigenous, and queer disabled writers, such as those in the Sins Invalid Performance Collective, Crip theory aligns with the disability justice framework. It argues that ableism is deeply tangled up with racism, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. It completely rejects the myth of the self sufficient, independent individual, celebrating radical interdependence instead. So, let us explore this important idea in more detail. Intersectionality and interdependence are the twin pillars of Crip theory and modern disability justice framework. While traditional disability rights movement historically focused on a single issue, gaining legal access for a primarily white middle class, cisgender, and straight disabled demographic, Crip theory insists that disability cannot be understood in a vacuum. By weaving together intersectionality and interdependence, Crip theory shift the focus from individual legal rights to a collective revolutionary rewriting of human value. Let us discuss some of the important components of these pillars of intersectionality and interdependence within Crip theory. Firstly, some of the important components of intersectionality include, coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw to describe the unique operation faced by Black women, intersectionality was brought into disability spaces by radical activists, notably the queer, disabled women of color in the Sins Invalid Collective, such as Patty Byrne and Stacey Milburn. Crip theory applies intersectionality to show that ableism relies on other systems of operation, including racism, capitalism, colonialism, and heteropatriarchy, to decide whose bodies are valuable and whose are disposable. Some of the major systems of operations related to intersectionality include race and disability. Institutional systems frequently pathologize Black and Indigenous bodies. For example, in medical and school settings, emotional distress or neurodivergence in Black individuals is often criminalized as dangerous behavior rather than supported as a mental health need. Queerness and Cripness. Queer and trans bodies have historically been labeled as diseased or malformed by psychiatric and medical institutions. Crip theory aligns with queer theory to reject the idea that there is a correct way to have a body, a gender, or a sexuality. Class and labor. Under capitalism, a person's worth is tied to their productivity. Poor and working class individuals lack the financial resources to purchase the expensive private health care or legal representation required to navigate an ableist world. Following intersectionality, some of the important component of the second aspect, that is interdependence, include exposing invisible support. Able-bodied people do not survive alone. They rely daily on massive, invisible networks of infrastructure, that is, municipal water lines, food supply chains, digital networks, public transit. Society calls this civilization rather than dependence. Eliminating the burden narrative. When a disabled person requires a personal care assistant, in short PCA, a sign language interpreter, or a flexible schedule, society frames them as a drain on resources. Interdependence reframes care as bid-directional collective responsibility, exposing the myth of the self-made individual. Compulsory able-bodiedness relies heavily on the capitalist myth of independence. The idea that a successful, dignified human being is completely self sufficient and owes nothing to anyone. Crip theory exposes this as a lie and champions radical interdependence. You might wonder then how Crip theory dismantles the three myths of self made person. So, Crip theory breaks down the illusion of the self sufficient individual by exposing three fundamental contradictions in how society viewed independence. The first one is the myth of the invisible infrastructure. Illusion is able bodied, wealthy individuals believe they are independent because they drive to work, buy groceries, and manage their homes without physical assistance. The Crip disruption is that Crip theory points out that no one is independent. Able bodied people rely on massive, structurally obscured networks of collective labor every single second. Public roads, agricultural supply chain, sewage systems, electrical grids, and digital infrastructure. Society frames this as civilization or convenience when utilized by the privileged, but levels it dependence when a disabled person requires a personal care assistant, a ramp, or a screen reader. The myth of individual merit. The illusion is that a person's economic and social success is purely the result of their own hard work, grit, and personal choices. The Crip disruption says that this myth relies on having a predictable, compliant, and continuously optimized body mind. It deliberately ignores how genetic lotteries, environmental racism, chronic illness, and structural ableism dictate a person's capacity to sell their labor. The self made narrative punishes the sick and disabled by transforming a structural exclusion into a personal moral failure. The myth of care as one way street, and it says that illusion is that needing help makes a person a passive tragic burden or a drain on resources, while the person providing care is a benevolent and independent savior. And the Crip disruption that disability justice advocates reframe care as bi-directional and collective. Disabled people are not merely passive recipients of care. They generate deep emotional intelligence, community safety networks, adaptive problem solving, and radical art. Interdependence asserts that giving and receiving care are equally valuable, dignified positions that alternate throughout every single human life. The myth of care as a one way street is the reductive cultural belief that care flows in only one direction, from a benevolent, capable, independent giver to a passive, helpless, dependent receiver. In Crip theory and disability justice, this myth is exposed as a fundamental distortion of human relationship. By framing the person receiving care as a tragic burden or a drain on resources, society strips disables, chronically ill, and aging individuals of their agency. So, Crip theory shatters this dynamic by proving that care is inherently bidirectional, collective, and generative. This critique of one way care leads directly to a critique of the violence inherent in one way models, specifically regarding disability, ideas of care and caregiver, and the idea of receiver as a deficit. Let us discuss this violence in greater details. The violence of one way model. The myth of one way care exemplifies the broader violence of the one way model, a logic that continues to structure the concept outlined below. The caregiver as savior. The non disabled or professional caregiver is framed as entirely autonomous and self sufficient, sacrificing their time to help someone less fortunate. The receiver as deficit. The disabled person is reduced to a passive medical checklist, their values is erased, and their dependency is treated as a personal and economic failure. The illusion of transaction, and this model treats care as a cold, transactional core or a form of state charity rather than a natural relational human interaction. The Crip reality says that care is multidirectional. Crip theory replaces this toxic hierarchy of caregiver and receiver within the concept of care, webs, and mutual care. It proves that disabled individuals are active creators and producers of care, wisdom, and community safety. Emotional and intellectual level. Disabled people routinely provide profound emotional support, survival strategies, and adaptive problem solving insights to their non disabled peers. This script knowledge is a vital resource for navigating a volatile world. Rebalancing the scales in an independent care relationship, roles are fluid. A person who needs physical help getting out of bed might simultaneously provide financial management, text based crisis support, community organizing, or deep artistic enrichment for the person helping them. Care across vulnerability. Disabled communities frequently practice peer to peer care. When multiple people with different chronic illness or mental health needs support one another, the binary of giver and receiver completely collapses. Another related concept to this is the liberation of shared vulnerability. Exploding the myth of the one way street liberates both parties. For the caregiver, it removes the crushing, impossible pressure to be an invulnerable, self sufficient superhero who never needs help. For the receiver, it restores their dignity, validating that their existence holds immense value regardless of their physical or cognitive capacities. Ultimately, Crip theory asserts that we will all occupy both sides of care relationship at various points in our lives. Embracing this fluidity is only way to build a society that safely holds us all. Some of the real world applications that traces this shift from autonomy to collective care that comes forth by unmasking the myth of the self-made individual include a change in our political, social, and cultural structure, such as in mutual aid network, instead of relying on cold, bureaucratic state charity that forces disabled people to continuously prove their deficits, interdependent communities build mutual aid pots. Survival resources are shared based on trust and collective need, operating under the radical principle from each according to their ability to each according to their need. In the climate crisis, interdependent disability activism proves that rigid individualism fails during climate disasters. When hurricanes or heat waves hit, it is not individual survival kits that save lives, but hyper-local community check-in networks that ensure the most vulnerable, power-dependent, and low-mobility neighbors are evacuated safely. In spatial design, while moving away from a standard architecture that segregate disabled people to backdoor service elevators, interdependent design creates spaces where everyone, parents with strollers, elderly folk, worker hauling freight, and wheelchair users moves through the same central universally accessible pathways together. Well, this table outlines the concept of intersectionality and interdependence, emphasizing their distinction from conventional advocacy. And we have two section: mainstream advocacy approach and intersectional and interdependence approach. So in mainstream advocacy approach, well, police reform demanding better police training to recognize disabled individual during a crisis, while in intersectional and independent approach, abolition and mutual aid, creating community-led crisis response networks so disabled, racialized individuals never have to face armed state violence. Similarly, in the first group, corporate DAI, hiring a token disabled worker to fulfill a diversity quota, expecting them to work a standard 40-hour week without disruption, while in the other group, collective care is structuring a workplace around mutual aid, asynchronous schedules, and shared tasks, ensuring the team thrives even during individual illness flare. And again, the first category says the legal fight, suing a business because their entrance lacks a ramp, focusing entirely on a single physical building. While in other group, disability justice framework says that recognizing that gentrification and environmental racism make it impossible for low income disabled people to even live in that neighborhood. So the narrative medicine, Crip theory, and literature. So scholars utilize Crip theory to reread historical and contemporary text, unpacking the ways disability has been pathologized as a personal tragedy or merely an object for medical cure. And some of the aspects are clinical education. Integrating Crip theory teaches medical and health professionals to recognize Crip knowledge, the lived expertise of disabled patient as a legitimate, valuable form of evidence in care. Health equity, researchers apply Crip critics to health framework like the Levesque framework for healthcare access to highlight how ableism, intersectionality, and structural violence act as foundational barriers to medical equity. Artistic practice, Crip world making, and Crip stoma pride serve as frameworks for destigmatizing bodily differences and building resilient networks of care outside rigid biomedical definitions. You might wonder then why Crip theory matters in health humanities. Firstly, Crip theory is used to analyze medical literature, patient narratives, and healthcare systems. It helps doctors, writers, and scholars see disability not as a tragic medical failure but as a valuable form of human diversity. Secondly, cripping normativity is a critical, activist, and academic method that treats the word crip as a verb. Rooted in the foundational text Crip theory by Robert McRuer, it is the intentional process of spinning, subverting, and exposing mainstream cultural practices to reveal the invisible able bodied and neurotypical assumptions built into them. Thirdly, in the health humanities, cripping works similarly to how queering functions in queer theory. It does not just demand access to existing institutions, it seeks to dismantle the very standard of what is considered a normal, healthy, or productive body and mind. It also questions how the normative structure inscribed by medical institutions treat any deviation from a standard body as a personal tragedy, an individual flaw, or a puzzle that must be permanently cured. It highlights a shift towards script subversion. Cripping normativity shifts the focus away from fixing the individual into normativity. Instead, it critiques how the medical gaze and societal infrastructure are constructed to violently marginalize anything it deems aberrant or defective. Crip theory also dismantles criponormativity. That means that even within disability spaces, certain standards of normalcy persist. This is known as crip normativity. the cultural pressure to perform disability in a clean, acceptable, or inspirational way. In this concept of Crip normativity, the normative structure highlights the media and medical narrative, celebrates the triumphant disabled person who works through the pain, successful mimics able bodied productivity, and does not make other uncomfortable. The Crip subversion conversely highlights that cripping this concept means celebrating the weak, deviant, sick, and perverted. It honors the messy, painful realities of chronic illness, flare ups, the cognitive differences without forcing individuals to fake wellness. Furthermore, it also explores normative time and space within Crip theory. Modern society links human work directly to a linear, highly productive life course, that is, school, full time employment, and retirement. In this concept of normative time and space, the normative structure highlights that institutional environments, including hospitals and universities, require fast paced efficiency and strict adherence to schedules. The crypt subversion conversely apply a crypt time in which scholars bend the clock to accommodate the fluctuating energy levels, medical needs, and processing speeds of the body mind. It asserts that a person's dignity is entirely detached from their capitalist productivity. Furthermore, it points towards disrupting compulsory able bodiness. This means that society operates on the assumptions that everyone is naturally able bodied and that being non disabled is the only preferred state of being. Let us discuss more about this aspect of Crip theory. So, what is disrupting compulsory able bodiness? So, disrupting compulsory able bodiness is a core political and theoretical mission of Crip theory. First coined by disability scholar Robert McRuer, compulsory able bodiness is the invisible cultural system that treats being non disabled as the only natural default and preferred way to exist. So, McRuer explicitly adapted this framework from Adrian Rich's concept of compulsory heterosexuality. Just as society operates on the unexamined assumption that everyone is straight until proven otherwise, it operates on the assumption that everyone should be fully able bodied and neurotypical. Disrupting this means exposing the fact that able bodiness is not a neutral biological truth, but a strictly polished social identity designed to serve capitalist productivity. The unspoken question, wouldn't you rather be like me? McRuer explained that compulsory able bodiness sustains itself by forcing disabled people to perpetually answer an unspoken question, yes, but in the end, wouldn't you rather be more like me? And the compulsion that society demands that disabled people agree that an able bodied life is inherently better, more fulfilling, and the ultimate goal. And the disruption is creeping. This dynamic means flatly answering no. It asserts that disability, chronic illness, and madness are valuable, generative ways of being in the world that do not require fixing or apologizing for. Key mechanisms of disruption. This framework requires moving past simple tolerance or inclusion to actively dismantle the structure of normalcy. Some of the key mechanisms of disruption in accordance with Crip theory and health humanities are first exposing masquerading non identity. Because able bodiness acts as a non identity, the invisible baseline, non disabled people rarely think about their own embodiment. Disrupting it forces the able bodied world to realize that their convenience is artificially manufactured by architecture, policy, and privilege, rejecting the docile disabled subject. The system tolerates disabled individuals as long as they try their hardest to mask their conditions, pass as normal, or perform inspirationally. True disruption rejects this pressure, celebrating the weak, deviant, sick, and perverted states of being instead. Third, Reframing interdependence. Compulsory able bodiness relies heavily on the myth of the rugged, entirely self sufficient individual. Disruption elevates radical interdependence, proving that nobody survives alone and that needing collective care is a universal human reality, not a personal failure. Fourth, decomposing the orderly body. Neoliberal capitalism demand orderly, predictable, and compliant bodies. Disrupting this involves what McRuer calls decomposition, intentionally occupying public and institutional spaces with messy, uncooperative, fluctuating, or noticeably disabled body mind. Let us explore more about this important mechanism. Decomposing the orderly body is an analytical and activist tactic formulated by Robert McRuer in his foundation text Crip Theory, Cultural Sign of Queerness and Disability. It functions as the literal and figurative undoing of the composed body required by medical institutions and neoliberal capitalism. McRuer repurposes the term from university composition courses. In those settings, students are forced to write in highly ordered, linear, and predictable structures to prove their competence. So, Crip theory argues that global healthcare and corporate system view human bodies in the same way as products that must remain orderly, predictable, efficient, and neatly composed. To decompose is to break down that false illusion of order and a composed body. The illusion of the composed body. To understand decomposition, one must first recognize the three core traits of the orderly body enforced by dominant health models. First, the static illusion is the false belief that a healthy body is predictable, stable, and remains the exact same from day to day. The myth. Western medicine often operates on the assumption that once a person is cured or reaches adulthood, their body enters a flat, reliable baseline of health. And the reality is that all human bodies are deeply volatile. For chronically ill and disabled individuals, the body mind is defined by unpredictable flare, fluctuating energy reserves, and shifting cognitive states. The Crip critic says that forcing people to perform a static identity creates a toxic culture of passing or masking. It forces individuals to exhaust themselves pretending to be perfectly fine when their internal reality is completely in flux. The independent illusion is that the expectation that a normal body operates as an isolated, self contained unit needing no outside help. The independent illusion is the dangerous myth that a normal, successful human being operates as an entirely self contained and self sufficient unit. And the myth is that modern society hyper focuses on individualism. Needing help with basic tasks like eating, bathing, moving, or processing information is framed as a personal failure or a tragic loss of dignity. And the reality is, absolutely no one is completely independent. Able bodied people rely on massive invisible network of infrastructure every single day, like public transit, grocery supply chain, municipal plumbing, digital grid. And the Crip critic is that Crip theory completely explodes this myth by championing radical interdependence. It argues that relying on personal care assistance, serving animals, or community network is not a sign of weakness, but a universal truth of human survival. The productive illusion and the rule that a body's value is directly tied to its speed, stamina, and economic output. So, the productive illusion is the capitalist rule that a human body's moral worth and social value are directly tied to its speed, stamina, and economic output. And the myth is that to be a valued member of society, a body must be well-oiled machine capable of working a standard 40 hours week, hitting linear deadlines, and constantly productive profit. And the reality is that human beings are biological entities, not industrial factories. Forcing bodies to conform to mechanical schedules causes widespread burnout, physical degradation, and mental health crisis. And the Crip critic says that the solution is dismantled using Crip time. Crip time insists that a person's right to rest, care, and dignity is completely detached from their ability to degenerate capital. It validates the act of showing down, taking breaks, and simply existing without needing to be useful. Now, how decomposition disrupt the system? Decomposition is not a passive decay, it is an active political performance of bodily reality that shatters normative expectations. It breaks the system's rule throughout distinct everyday disruptions. So, embracing the flux, the orderly body hides its weaknesses. Decomposition openly flaunts the fluctuating, messy realities of the body mind. It presents a body that leaks, twitches, requires sudden bed rest, or experiences unpredictable pain flares, refusing to apologize for failing to maintain a composed facade. Taking up space inappropriately. Mainstream healthcare environments are built to process bodies cleanly and quietly. Disabled individuals engage in performative acts of decomposition while physical occupying spaces in ways that resist standard flows. This includes slowing down busy hospital corridors, requiring complex equipment setup in rigid public spaces, or demanding that an entire room alter its spacing, exposing the lever of maintenance. The composed body pretends that health takes no effort. Decomposition makes the invisible, grueling work of survival visible. It lays bare the pills, the catheters, the personal care assistant, and the raw vulnerability required just to exist, dismantling the myth of completely independent self made individual. Resisting the fetishized final cure. Medical system demand a happy ending where a patient is successfully rehabilitated back into a standard work. Decomposition completely rejects the mandate for a complete cure. It celebrates the permanently incomplete, ongoing, and structurally uncooperative body as a fully valid way to live. So the table highlights key differences between the composed ideal by the able-bodied worldview and the decomposed reality that can be analyzed through Crip subversion under the Crip theory. So one is the composed ideal, other is the decomposed reality. So under the composed ideal, the compliant patient sits quietly, details symptoms linearly, and seeks to quickly return to a baseline of able-bodied productivity. And the decomposed reality says the disruptive body mind explains illness through fragmented narrative, challenges medical authority, and demands that the clinic adapt to their pacing. Standardized care pathways under the composed ideal says that one size fits all medical guidelines that assume all human bodies degrade and recover at identical orderly rates, while the decomposed reality says that the crypt navigation forcing system to acknowledge that healing is volatile, circular, and completely unbound by institutional clocks. Ultimately, decomposing the orderly body is about safety and solidarity. When disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent individuals stop spending massive amounts of energy trying to look composed, they expose how fragile and artificial their standard of normalcy truly is. And the illusion of the composed body are the foundational myths that healthcare systems, corporate workplaces, and mainstream culture use to define what a normal human being looks like. In Crip theory and health humanities, these illusions are exposed as artificial standards. They are designed to benefit a capitalist society that demands maximum efficiency, predictable labor, and minimal accommodation. By pulling back the curtain on these illusions, scholars and activists reveal how much energy disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent individuals waste trying to maintain a fake facade of wellness. So, the real world academic application in nursing and medical education says that scholars use McRuer's work to critique how nursing curricula treat disabled bodies merely as passive medical checklists or tragedies to be managed, pushing instead to center disabled voices as active possessors of health expertise. Some of the real world academic applications are in architect and built environment rather than tackling a hidden wheelchair ramp onto the back of a building to meet bare minimum compliance. Designers Crip a speciality by making universal flexible access the very centerpiece of the architecture. In the workplace, resisting the compulsory standard means validating the workers who requires a synchronous schedule, crib time break, and fluctuating workloads directly serving human worth from strict capitalist output. With this, I wrap up the discussion on crib theory. Till then, thank you.